The wind came off the shivering sea with teeth in it, worrying at the old scars of the wall until the ice groaned like a thing in pain. John stood in the yard beneath the shadow of the great white cliff, breath smoking, cloak heavy with hoarfrost. The scaffold had been pulled down, the nooses burned. The men who had put knives in him lay in a pyre beyond the far gate, flames low and sullen in the wet. He could still feel their steel in his belly if he let himself remember, the quick shock of it, the bewilderment. But memory cooled inside him the way a forge dwindles, coals going from red to black. He touched the pommel of Longclaw as if to remind himself he was standing. Dolorous Ed watched a new batch of raw men shiver before the armory, brothers and not brothers both. Knees knocking, fingers blue where their gloves had ripped, faces pinched and stubborn. "They sent us the South's finest, Lord," Ed murmured, voice as dry as the frozen straw at his feet. Which is to say, men who'd run from the first snowflake if the road south weren't already clogged with them. "I had one ask me whether the wall was sharp. If they stand," John said, "it will be enough that they stand." "Standing's a skill we've been short of since the mutiny," Ed said, then glanced at John's face and softened. "Pardon. I speak as I do when I'm cold." "Then you should say nothing at all," Tormund Giantsbane said from the gate, thumping snow from his bearded chest as he came in with the smell of wood smoke and wet wolf clinging to him. "Save to the fire. Fire answers back." "Does it?" Ed said, unimpressed. "I've been having long talks with the fire this last fortnight. It mostly says, 'Use more wood.'" Tormund laughed, big and honest, and clapped John on the shoulder hard enough to jolt bone. "You are too thin, Crow. Died and came back with less of you. Next time, take more meat from the other side." "There won't be a next time," John said, quiet enough that only they could hear. The yard stilled at those words anyway, as if the wall itself cocked a great white ear. Eyes turned. Stannis' old men and the Karstark stragglers who'd stayed. Wildlings in mismatched mail and stitched furs. Brothers of the Watch wearing cloaks rubbed shiny with age. Davos Seaworth stood by the oat bins, counting sacks, nodding to himself. He lifted a hand to John in a way that acknowledged command without putting a crown on its head. John drew breath deep and cold and tasted old iron. "Hear me," he said. The yard's little sounds, men coughing, the clink of bridle rings, the creak of rope, fell away. "I am Lord Commander of the Night's Watch while breath is in me. I have by right the power to lay down my cloak. I will not. I swore my life and honor to the Night's Watch. Men failed me. The Watch did not. My watch continues." A murmur, then a rolling answer. Boots striking ice, staves on the ground. A hoarse cheer not made for southern halls. Ed blinked at him as if the announcement had been the least likely of a dozen bad choices. Tormund bared his teeth, pleased. Davos's nod deepened, a man marking the moment and tucking it away. "Then we'd best get you some brothers who won't try to put holes in you," Ed said, trying and failing to sound aggrieved. "Since you insist on continuing to be stab-worthy. Begin with those who didn't run," John said. "We'll make more of them. We'll need more." "You'll need food," Davos said, stepping forward. "Grain's running thin, and the salt cod we got in Frost last month was more salt than cod. I can beg Bear Island for oats and onions and perhaps men for the soup kettles. Lyanna Mormont's as likely to send 10-year-olds with ladles as grown soldiers, but they'll serve better than what we've got." "Ask," John said. "Ask everyone. Ask the Manderleys, the Glovers, the Hornwoods. Ask and keep asking." Davos's gray eyes flicked across the yard. "You might also think to ask your sister." The word sister went through him like a blade slipped between mail rings. He felt its blood heat and kept his face still. "Sansa is safe," John said. "As the gods permit," Davos murmured. "If they do. She's south of the neck. I've had no word." "You'll have more than word," Davos said. "She's in the yard." The gate creaked. Horses clattered in, steaming. The men on them hunched with cold and road-tired and wary. Among them a woman in a patched cloak sat a mare whose bones showed like a book's ribs, posture rigid, head bare despite the knives of wind. Red hair shot with dirt framed a face all cheekbones and stubborn mouth. No southern lady. She had that stark look like stone made to walk. Brienne of Tarth rode behind her with Podrick Payne and a white road dog of a horse that looked as if it could bite steel. Sansa's gaze raked the yard, and for a heartbeat it did not know him. Then it did. Changed. She slid down from the mare and did not wait for grooms or ceremony or the dignity she had learned. She ran. He was already moving, and when she struck him it was as if the cold fell away. She smelled of smoke and horse and snow and the faint clean of soap. She felt like home. "Jon," she whispered into his collar. "Jon, Jon." He held her, and the ache he had carried since he was a boy, who did not belong anywhere, sang out so raw and bright. He had to put a hand flat between her shoulders to remind himself to breathe. When she stepped back, he saw the changes in her. The set of jaw, the scars of hunger and fear and traveling. The way her eyes took the measure of everything without seeming to. She had grown into Lady Sansa like a sword growing into its sheath, made for it by pain and being tempered in a hard fire. "You're alive," she said. "So are you," he said, and the words were as much prayer as observation. The wind reminded them of itself, sharp enough to make tears water and freeze. "Hot broth," Jon said. "A fire. Blankets. Ed. On it?" Ed muttered, but it was Brienne who had already moved to see to it, her watchful eyes on everyone, hands steady on her sword hilt in a way that said it would not leave that hilt while breath lasted. Podrick scurried behind her. The boy taller than last Jon had seen him and still dog-eager to please. They ate in the hall where the heat never reached the far corners, bowls between their chilled hands, steam fogging the air. Ghost lay by Jon's boots with his head on his paws like a frozen flame banked low, eyes open and watching. Tormund ate like a man who believed soup ought to be fought with. Davos poured ale and set the flagon down with care so as not to waste a drop. Sansa spoke when her hands steadied on the earthenware. She had always had a keen ear for cadence. Even now, the shape of her words made room for the truth at their center. "Winterfell is in the hands of a mad dog," she said. "Ramsay Snow calls himself Bolton. He has Rickon." The name fell with the weight of a stone on water, making unseen ripples that struck old wounds. "He has him at Winterfell as bait. He sent me a letter." She pulled it from her cloak, the seal broken, the words inside a mess of cruelty and sharpened pride. Jon read and kept his face because faces are banners and banners need hoisting at the right time. He knew that trick now. The letter's last lines might as well have been written in his own blood. "Come see me, bastard." Ghost's lip lifted from one long tooth. Tormund belched in a way that was not laughter but related to laughter at some distance. Davos wiped a hand over his mouth as if to clear taste. "Brother," Sansa said, "we must take back our home. We have the Vale Knights if we can ask them properly. We can call the Manderleys. The Umbers." She stopped, thinking of the letter, thinking of traitors. She began again. "The North remembers, but we will need you to call it to its feet." Jon's thumb had found the paper's torn edge and worried it into a softened curl. He laid the letter back on the table as a man might return a knife. He could see Bran at his elbow from another life, small and fierce, complaining that the Oldnan stories went on too long. Arya wild-haired and always where she shouldn't be. Robb laughing with a stag's proud head and a wolf's gentleness inside him. Rickon as a smudge of dirt and grin, running everywhere. He could feel his father's hand on his shoulder and hear him say, "You may not have my name, boy, but you have my blood, and no one can take that from you." He closed his hand because it would have shaken. "I cannot." Sansa's eyes did not widen. She had grown too careful for that. They narrowed instead, turned speculative, then hot. "You cannot." "I am Lord Commander of the Night's Watch," he said softly. "We do not take sides in the wars of the realm. We protect the realm. Ramsay Bolton is a monster. He is a monster within the realm. I swore. I will not break that for." He almost said you and bit the word off, tasting iron. "For Winterfell. Not even for Winterfell. You died," she said, fury a slender thread in her voice. "Your watch was ended. It would be a poor oath that broke when it was most needed, Jon said. A poor man who made it so. The anger broke briefly, and she leaned toward him as if to make him understand by proximity what words could not. We were children together, she said. We were made to learn the shapes of forks and the order of dances and the names of men who would never sit at our tables. We were told that honor is a thing you wear and never take off. Jon, listen. Honor that becomes a noose is no honor. The watch will be dust for want of men to man the kitchens if the north falls to this dog. Take Winterfell and you can send it bread. You can send it boys who will grow into men of the watch because they are not dead or flayed. Help me. Davos set his cup down with care and did not look at either of them. Tormund scratched at his beard and studied the rafters. Ed's mouth quirked, which in him passed for the concern of a man whose companion had decided to step backward toward a cliff. Jon could feel all of them in the room, their weight on the air, their attention like a dozen hands. He found he was looking at his own across the table, scarred and thin and whiter than they had been. Those hands had held a dead boy. They had struck away friend and lifted a blade to treacherous necks. They had dragged him out of his own shroud. He slid them off the table and laid them in his lap where he could not see them. If I take Winterfell, he said, I break the one thing in me that survived. I know what I am, Sansa. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. That's not a song in a book. It's me. He swallowed. But the free folk are not of the watch. I cannot order them. I can release them from nothing. Tormund's eyes brightened as if he had been waiting for that hinge to turn. He rumbled. A free man goes where he likes and puts his axe where it does most good. If a red dog kills a boy, a free man swings his axe at the dog. The crow never told him to. The crow cannot stop him. Davos glanced from one to the other, measuring, the way a captain gauges a narrowing channel. It is true, Lady Sansa, that the Night's Watch cannot march. It is also true that friends can. Allies can. Men who owe a life for a favor can. Sansa's eyes shifted to Jon's, quick and clever, seizing what was offered. Would your friends march for Winterfell? Jon did not answer at once. He could taste the word in his mouth like a sweet that would be bitter at the end. If free folk march, he said at last, they go knowing the watch will not shield them from what comes of it. They go for themselves, and for the boy you named. For Rickon, Sansa said, voice breaking on the smallness of the name. She put both hands flat on the table and leaned on them as if to steady herself against the old hall's slow rocking. I will write to Lord Royce, to the Vale. I will speak to Lady Mormont. I will go to each hearth if I must. If you will not lead, then send with me men who can. I have Brienne, and she's an army by herself, but the North will listen to your name when I speak it. They'll listen to yours more, Jon said, but I will send Davos as my voice, and Tormund as a storm. Ed will hold with me. He looked up at his first steward and saw in Ed's long, melancholy face the shade of a smile like a rare winter sun. We'll need food, Fletchers, smiths for spearheads, if there is dragonglass. There is, said a voice from the shadows by the hearth that had not spoken for all the meal. Melisandre had sat apart, as if she were a coal set aside from the fire lest it scorch. Her hair fell black down her back, her red gown's color diluted by the cold to the color of old blood. It is under the world's skin, in places where it is thin. North of the wall in a valley where the rocks run green and the air bites like a viper. I saw it once in smoke. I saw children with eyes like leaves and hands like bones set it beneath a heart tree. Davos's hand flinched on his tankard. His mouth went thin. Your smoke has led us to many places, he said, not kindly. Melisandre inclined her head. I have been wrong. I have been wrong in ways I cannot cleanse. The fire does not burn lies away, but it leaves what endures. Her eyes found Jon's and held them. The wall trembles. What you refuse, others will take. What you bind, others will unravel. But there is one not only you can tie. Speak plain, Jon said. The prince that was promised is not a prince, she said. He may be called bastard, and he may wear black. He may be a man who refuses a crown and so becomes a king stronger than any crown. Or he may be a man who clings to his oath and drowns the world with it. She lifted one hand. The red stone at her throat beat like a slow heart. Choose with your whole heart, Jon Snow. Not with fear, not with pride, with truth. If the truth in you says stay, stay. She has never loosened a knot without tightening another, Jon thought, and yet the old, fierce part of him that had wanted to be told he was chosen, that he was not a mistake the world had made and left to cry, stirred and then lay still. I will stay, he said, and the room, the world, seemed to take that breath with him and let it out. They made their plans there in the sight of a fire that burned too low. Sansa wrote by lamplight, her hand steady, the long slants and sharp points of her script precise, addressed to Lord Yohn Royce and to Lady Lyanna Mormont and to every northern house that might answer. Davos packed his bag with the measured care of a man who had buried daughters and learned there are some voyages you do not return from, whether your feet bring you back or not. Tormund sharpened axes and told stories filthy enough to turn the air warmer. Jon sent a raven to Eastwatch by the sea and another to the Shadow Tower and one more to the ruins of Hardhome, which was no post at all but a wound that still bled men back in trickles. He slept when he could and dreamed of snow falling in a room that had no roof and a woman's voice singing under it and a wolf's breath at his ear. When dawn came, it came with a light like iron. Davos and Tormund rode south with Sansa and Brienne and Podrick. Sansa held Jon tightly at the gate and then not at all, because she had learned to leave as well as to arrive. If we fail, she said in his ear, promise me you will not let him have the north. Burn what must be burned. Break what must be broken. Don't let him have it. I promise you I will hold the wall, Jon said. Hold the north, she whispered fiercely. The wall is part of it. We are all part of it. She drew back and regarded him with those quick eyes that once had been full of songs. They were full of something harder now. We will make Winterfell ours again, with or without you. Make it yours, Jon said. It was always yours. It was easier once they were gone because there was only the one path. He walked it until his feet forgot they had other roads. He drilled the men until arms shook and set their task again. He walked the ring wall at night and stood under the old weirwood's red leaves, brittle as scabs in the frost, and asked for nothing. Ghost ranged by his side and came back with snow on his muzzle and the copper tang of blood in his fur. The ravens came and went, their claws sounding like small hammers on the sills. From Old Town, a raven brought a fine hand on a narrow strip of parchment, inked with a precise, fussy pen. Sam's writing. The letters lifted off the page like the sound of his voice, breathless and pleased. Dragonglass in abundance at Dragonstone, a mountain of it, a whole island made of it, a thing of the old fire. The Archmesters believed little and condescended much, but Sam believed because he had killed an other and watched it shatter to blue shards under obsidian. He also wrote of a rumor in the oldest books that the wall had spells frozen into it at making, old powers laid down by children, by builders, by nameless hands, that could be broken if a marked thing crossed it. Jon read that line twice and sat with it. He had dreamed lately of Bran. Small feet in the snow, laughter, then the laughter gone, replaced by cold, and something else riding close behind him. The next night the horn at the gate blew late and harsh. Jon went there with men who had their bows in hand and the strings warmed under their cloaks, with Ed muttering about wolves who refused to piss where they were told, with Melisandre walking soft. He went, and the forms that staggered toward the light fell to their knees because of the cold and because what chased them was worse. Meera Reed carried Bran over the threshold of the gate like a life-saving queen crossing a river, light as a reed herself and white with cold. The boy's hands clenched in her cloak. His eyes were wrong. They were too old and full of too many things, as if the night had cut out its own eyes and laid them in his skull as a joke. Jon had to teach himself not to recoil at what he loved. Bran, he said, finding a smile in his mouth that hurt to make. Jon, Bran said in a voice he had never had before. They put him under fur and piled stones around the braziers to hold heat. Meera slept like a soldier between breaths. falling down where she sat and waking with the same jerk that men give on galleys when the oarmaster slaps the drum. Melisandre stood over Bran for a long time, watching with a particular interest that made Davos keep between them like a low gray wall. After a time, Bran's eyes cleared and were only a boy's eyes again, though that lasted as long as a candle in wind. "The mark," he said when Jon asked him, as if he could see the question hovering behind Jon like a sword. "He touched me when I was in the cave. He was not allowed to enter, but he found me in the wood. It burned cold and then it didn't burn at all. They said he could follow me by it. Can he cross with it?" Jon asked. Bran looked at the wall, really looked the way Jon looked at men before he put them in a line, and the eyes went strange again. "He can make things to break things," he said slowly. "He is not made only of ice. He is made of will. But the wall is old. The strongest part of the magic is not the ice. It is the truth it was built on." "What truth?" Davos said carefully. "That men kept it," Bran said. "That men meant it." Melisandre's red stone beat slow. "And if the men who kept it fail it?" Bran's mouth pulled tight. "Then it becomes only a wall." Jon laid his palm flat on the old wood table near Bran's head and felt the grain under his hand, the scars of knives and of years. He thought of his men lifting stones, of Ed's dry patience, of Tormund laughing danger. To comfort others, of boys learning the weight of a spear. "We will not fail it," he said. It did not feel like a promise that could be promised. It felt like a thing he could only keep doing until he could not. They went ranging again, not far at first, then farther, because the wild was a tide, and if you did not learn how it ran, it would slap you from your feet. They found a little valley like Melisandre's fire had promised. Rock green with old lichen, air that bit, a heart tree rising out of ice with roots like a giant's hands. In its shadow, obsidian lay as glassy black knives forced up by the earth's grinding teeth. They took it out with picks wrapped in leather to keep handles from sticking to palms and carried it back in sackcloth. The smith from Molestown, who had never expected to stay this long, swore there was no way to seat obsidian on iron, then found a way by testing, by mixing copper and iron, by binding with rawhide and tar. The first spear splintered in two. The second held. By the time the wind shifted, they had a rack of ugly, black-jawed spears and a handful of knives set in wood. From the south, the ravens brought answers like winter fruit. Lyanna Mormont's letter was short and fierce. "The watch is the wall, and the wall is the watch, and House Mormont remembers both. If you say it is need, we answer." She sent barrels of oats and boys too young to fight, who came with bright eyes and stood by the kettles with ladles like scepters. Lord Glover's answer was grudging and late. The Manderlys was full of words about sacred vows and fish pies and grace, and under the frosting of it Jon tasted hunger. From Lord Royce, a more cautious letter, all courtesy and an eye kept on the game board. And one more, that Sansa did not write but that bore her weight anyway. Winterfell had risen. The Boltons had fallen beneath a blizzard of lances made of the Vale's iron, their dogs dying under the winter oaks with their guts frozen to the leaves. Rickon had run for his life and died with an arrow in his back on snow so white the red spread forever. Sansa took the castle's keys with hands that shook and then did not shake. The flayed men came down. He read the letter, and it felt like ice water hitting hot stone. He wanted to be two men, and the wanting almost broke him. He went to the old Godswood within Castle Black and knelt under the tree that had seen too much and said nothing out loud. Ghost pressed his great head against Jon's shoulder until his breath warmed the wool. Ed found him there with his hair rimed and his eyebrows white with frost and stood beside him without fuss. "The North is a strange creature," Ed observed as if to the tree. "It snarls when you feed it and licks your hand when you starve it. I don't recommend either. Are you going to go be a Stark hero and get everyone to sing about you one day when they're not being eaten?"
"No."
"Good," Ed said, and after a moment, "It would have been magnificent, though. You on a big horse with a bigger sword, everyone shouting. I'd have made a very melancholy song of it." "Make a song about soup," Jon said. "It will be more use." He wrote to Sansa that night with hands that could do it now without the old clumsiness. He wrote, "I am proud of you as our father would be, The watch cannot come to Winterfell, but the watch can hold the gate that matters. Winter is coming and the dead with it. He told her of Bran's return and of the mark and of the old spells. He told her where the obsidian lay. He asked for smiths and for men with strong backs, and no fear of breaking went wrong. He asked for wool, for mittens, and for salt. He asked for what he needed, and the asking felt like another oath. The first test came at Eastwatch, when the sea breathed in and did not breathe out again. The cliff there rose black and steep, and the low tide gave them the usual narrow shore of frozen stone where men could fish with lines and not be dashed to paste against the rocks. But that morning the water skinned over with a gray film that thickened as they watched. The ice ran out like a road. Even before the horn blew, the wind changed. It had a sound in it like many feet. Jon sent Ed by the king's road path with 30 men and took 40 himself along the wall walk, Tormund loping like a bear at his side. The wind flayed the skin off the cheeks of the men who followed. Ice made cruel noise under their boots, and the sea below went dull as old tin. From the higher platform at Eastwatch they could see them. A long black rumor moving over the new ice. A crowd of the dead that did not spread out like an army but like hunger itself. Ragged clothes and bone-bright hands and the ungleam of frozen eyes. Here and there a pale shadow moving behind them. Their captains on flesh that did not steam and horses that did not tire. "Ah," Tormund said in a tone that was half intimate, half relieved, as if an old adversary had finally remembered an appointment. "There. Good. Good," said Ed, arriving breathless and appalled. "Is not the word I would have chosen. What in the seven hells do we do when the sea freezes? It's supposed to be their weakness, water." "It was never water," Jon said. He found he was strangely calm. "It was that they had none. They have it now, so we do the work that ours is." He looked at the lines of men fidgeting with their gloves, with their fear, with their bowstrings. He lifted Longclaw, loose at the front. Aim for knees, aim for joints, burning barrels when they're near the cliff. Spears for the Pale Riders. Remember what breaks them. He moved along the line, touching shoulders, saying little. The first volleys were ugly and short. The arrows flew and fell and made men slower without making them less. The dead came on with the patience of winter. When they reached the foot of the cliff, they climbed where even goats would have refused to, fingers like knives digging, not caring when the skin tore away. Men who have never disliked cliffs still dislike them when hands with no blood in them find purchase. "Now," Jon said, and Ed signaled with a rag on a stick, and the barrels went over and struck and broke and lit. Fire ran down the cliff face and across old oil and slewed sideways on black slick. Kissed the first ranks and made them burn. Burning dead reeked in a way that went straight to the bottom of the stomach and made men gag behind their scarves. The next ranks climbed over them. They always did. One of the Pale Riders came up the path the waves had made and not taken back. He swung a blade like a sliver of shattered lake that sang when it moved. A brother thrust with a spear, and the spear broke and flew apart into glittering, useless fragments, and the brother stared at what used to be a spear and not at his life. Jon vaulted down from the parapet and met the other on the narrow ground where two men could not pass without touching. He knew now how to do this because there had been a first time, and that first time had taught him that fear must be held in the mouth like water until you could spit it at the right moment. The air around the other tasted like cold metal. Its horse's head turned toward Jon slow as a weight on a chain, eyes like holes punched through ice to the dark beneath. Jon lifted Longclaw and felt the old Valyrian steels answer up his arm like a second pulse. The first exchange was a test. The other's blade struck with no weight behind it and still forced him back, his muscles laboring, his boots slipping. He snarled without meaning to, and the sound came back to him from the cliff as if something inside the rock had made it too. He feinted low and cut at the wrist. The other sheared a hair from his hood with a casual backhand and did not move its face, which was the worst of all. He remembered then, not with words but with body knowledge, the moment outside the fist when the White Walker had laughed in a soundless way as if trapped in glass and then had screamed when Longclaw bit. He stepped in when he should have stepped out, gave blood to the blade with his shoulder, and brought Longclaw up in a crooked blow like a badly made thing. It landed properly anyway. The other's sword shattered not all at once, but in a mad shimmy that ran along its length and turned it into a drifting of hard blue snow. The other made no sound that ears could register, but John felt something pull like wind suddenly changing direction. He put the point through it the way a man puts a spade through hard ground. Came apart like frost on a window when you breathe on it. On the wall above, the men were cheering and gagging and cursing as men do when they think the day may be theirs. The dead didn't know how to cheer or curse. They climbed. They climbed in the teeth of fire, and it burned them, and they climbed anyway. When they were close enough, Ed's line put spears down into eyes and mouths, and here and there a spear with an ugly black head took a dead thing out, and it fell and did not rise. The dragon glass did what it always had. It returned what should never have come. The fight ground on like the sea in winter, slow and without mercy. Tormund laughed with his teeth and took the path like a goat, and John had a moment to see him meet another pale rider lower down, the two of them cutting and coming on and cutting again as if they were dancing a dance that had begun before there were songs. He lost sight of them when smoke bent the world and the wind blew ash in great clots. He lost sight of much. He kept his feet. He kept his men speaking to him in briefs and curses. He kept the line from running. When the light began to fail to the point where the blue eyes were easier to see than the bodies that held them, the dead began to go. Not because they had had enough, because they had some other plan. They were feeling us, Ed said in awe and loathing as the last black shapes shrank across the new ice, like a butcher feeling a cow, working out where the bones are. His hair had frozen to his cheek with the sweat, and the heat from the braziers ran off him like someone else's breath. They're learning us, John said. He looked at the dead piled along the cliff's foot and the charred grease that had once been men. We'll learn back. They dragged bodies and burned them. They sent a raven to Winterfell that said, "This time we held," and another to the Shadow Tower that said, "Salt is low and oil lower, send." When the men sat because their legs couldn't be asked to do more, John stood because he wouldn't let his see him fail. He slept 3 hours that night and woke with his ribs aching from where he had turned wrong under the furs and with Longclaw's shape on his palm like a ghost. In the morning the sea was water again, black and sullen, and there were chunks of old ice turning slow as thoughts. The north answered to need as it often did, late and grudging, and then all at once. Carts came up with wheels frozen to the axles that had to be chipped free, bearing sacks of oats and old cheese and onions still wearing dirt. A smith from Winterfell with hands the size of bread loaves presented himself and said Lady Sansa told him to make points until his fingers bled bare, and he meant to do it. 3 boys from Motley's Mill came with 4 grandmothers among them, who took the kitchens like a fort and brought order to flour. An old midwife from the Gift came too, to scold men for not eating like men and to tell John he ought to sleep properly if he meant to lead properly, and he told her he would take it under advisement. From Winterfell, letters written in Sansa's neat hand saying, "Send me more." From Lord Royce a letter that said in its careful way, "The Vale will stand by Winterfell's decision and the North's will." A different letter, short and crooked, that came late one night. "We did not want kings and found we had them anyway, cousin, and now we do not want winter but we have it. I am not a little lord in the way that matters. I am the boy you left who ran too fast." Bran had written that one, sitting up with eyes like holes. John sat with it through the night and put it away where he kept precious things. The pommel of Longclaw and the letter Ned Stark had once written him not with words but by putting a hand on his hair and smiling and saying nothing. Davos came back with lines in his face that had not been there when he left and with news you could break teeth on. "Ramsay Bolton is dead," he said without flourish, standing over the map with his hands braced on the table. His hounds helped him to it. The Umbers are leashed to Winterfell. Wyman Manderley is carving pies for the right men now, if the gods have any appetite for humor. Sansa Stark stands in her father's hall and signs orders in a hand that doesn't shake. Lord Royce watches like a cat by the hearth. Littlefinger watches like a cat through a crack in the door. And no one wants to hear about dead things that walk. They say they will when the snow lets them. Snow will not, I think, be inclined. And Rickon? John asked, though he knew. Buried, Davos said, which was the best word. Brupe. With wolves. John breathed once and felt it lodge like a shard. He let it lodge. Pain had to live somewhere, better in the chest than in the hand that held the blade. "Lady Sansa sent you this," Davos added. The letter inside was short, Sansa's writing again. It said, "I named you in the hall as the truest Northman we have. They called you brother first and then something softer. Come take the rooms you never had." Said, "I need you." It said, "I know what you will say and I hate it and I love you." He folded it and put it with the others. Then he went to the wall and laid his palm flat against the ice and felt what he had felt since he was a boy standing under it. Small, strong, necessary. The ice thrummed like an old harp in a wind you couldn't hear. Bran stood beside him, face turned toward something only he could see, and said, "He is near. He is patient. He has all the time there ever was." "Men don't," Jon said. The second assault came with no sea and no riders to see, not a head-on thing you could meet with iron, but with wind that died and then came back full of whispers. Men started hearing someone calling their names. Ed heard his mother's voice telling him to come inside now and stop playing in the snow. A boy from White Harbor heard his brother, dead of fever last year. They went to the parapet with the words hanging from their mouths and found the shadows moving. Not bodies. Not until the shadows found theirs. Then they had bodies enough. They put torches in hands and oil in tubs and stood in close and squalid formation in the inner yard while the shadows tried to teach them how fear rearranges a line. Bran sat with his hands on the table and sweat beaded at his hairline and said in a voice that was not his own and was all the same, "There." He pointed at air, and Jon ordered a volley into it, and one of the shadows came down like a sack of grain dropped from a warehouse pulley and writhed in a way that men wrap wounds. They burned it where it lay while it howled like iron in water and did not watch the shape it gave off when it died. Melisandre came to Jon after that with an expression like someone who has placed a jewel in a stream and watched it wash downstream into the dark. "I did not tell you all," she said, "about the child." Davos had been waiting for those words for a long time. He took them like a man takes a blow that was promised and finally had the courtesy to arrive. It broke something old in him that had held. Jon did not let it pass. He could not. Justice and mercy in winter are as often the same thing as not. He did not kill her. He sent her south with a ban on her name and a warning that the wall would have her blood if she crossed its shadow again. Davos bowed to that with the dignity of a mast that refuses to crack until the last wave has done with it. "I will not be forgiven," Melisandre said at the gate with the red stone going dull and bright, dull and bright. "That is not why you are sent away," Jon said. "It is because some things cannot be in the same place at once." He did not say love and justice. He did not say fear and command. He had learned lately what not to say. When the lake in the haunted forest froze so hard you could drop an anvil on it and it would ring like a bell, Jon sent a ranging with dragonglass-tipped spears and fast feet to bring back a thing that could move and not think. They needed proof for the men who would come here only for proof. They brought it back bound in ropes and roaring without breath in it. A farmer once by the look of the hands. A corpse that hated ropes without knowing why. It strained toward heat like a moth without a mind. They kept it in a pen of iron and prayer until the snow let the roads think about being roads again. Davos took it then on a wain that stank and rattled and went like a funeral trying not to be one to Winterfell. The hall there was fuller than Jon could imagine it being without seeing it. He imagined it anyway. He imagined the way the white surged when it smelled so many lives, and the way the Vale Knight's hands went white on spear shafts, and the way Lord Royce's face barely moved and his knuckles told all. He imagined Sansa not flinching because she had learned not to. Later, Davos's letter said, "They believe. Not all. Enough. Men will come. Not all. Enough. Enough is a poor measure and the best one there is." When winter laid its full hand on the wall, you could not hear men speak unless they leaned into your shoulder and shouted. The cold made everything small and sharp. Jon learned to think in the small, sharp spaces between the tasks. He never once let himself see Winterfell except as a place on a map that had sent him what he'd asked for. He let Sansa's letters sit unopened on the table until night when the light flattened grief and then opened them. He said none of the words he found there out loud. In the last moon before the long night, the wall shook. It did not fall then. It shook like a beast rousing. Men fell on their knees because it felt to their bones as if the ground had moaned. The crack that opened on the eastward face near a tower no one had liked because it leaned like an old drunk was not wide enough for a man to pass through. It was wide enough for a cold that was not the air's cold to breathe on them. Bran laid his hands against the ice there and went white as salt and said, "He has the horn." "The horn of what?" Ed demanded, because if you give men too many names for doom, they stop listening. "Joramun," Bran said, "or the lie that is the truth. He has a thing men believe in. That helps." He turned his head very slowly. "He needs help less than we do, but he has all he could ask for." "Good," Ed said with savage cheer. "I was worried he'd been suffering." They braced the crack with old timbers from the armory roof that had needed mending anyway, and with prayer, and with the simple presence of men who stood there holding spears, because you can hold a spear when you can't fix a wall. Jon sent a raven south that said, "Now." He sent another east to Eastwatch, where the cliff fell and where the sea had begun again to have ideas about being stone. Winterfell answered with men and food and one thing Jon had not asked for and did not know how to accept. Sansa herself, climbing the steps of the wall with her breath visible and her cloak dragging a clean line in the snow. She wore no jewels. She did not need them. The north hung on her arm and came when she pulled. She looked at the wall not the way you look at a marvel, but the way you look at a work. She looked at Jon as if to remind herself of everything that had come between and to refuse to let it stand. "I cannot make. You stay away," she said by way of greeting. "I am not leaving," he said, and they both smiled at the absurdity of saying what they had always known. They made a camp within Castle Black that could have been a little town. The words spoken under the weirwood there at night moved the needles. Sansa went among the men like a hearthkeeper with a sword no one saw. She took in a torn glove and ordered 5 mended. She saw a boy weeping because he wanted his mother, and she found him work and swore at him until he remembered himself. She stood with Bran and let him touch her hand with those strange eyes. She kept Littlefinger at bay with a look and a list of tasks. Brienne stalked the yards like a winter cat. "You could still be queen in the north," Tormund observed to Jon in the way men say. "There's a rabbit over there if you want to chase it for sport." "She is," Jon said. "You know I meant you," Tormund said. Not irritated, merely amused that crows could not learn what was obvious. "I am what I am," Jon said again, too tired for metaphor. "More the pity," Tormund said, "but also more the reason I let my sons stand in your line. Men will do for you what they don't do for kings." When it came without horns or roar, because the dead do not need fanfare to make themselves known. The night was a white fury, and the wind was a hand over mouths. Snow moved in ways it does not do when it is only snow. Darkness has teeth. The first sign was that the fires along the wall walk went blue and then guttered as if a child had pinched them shut. The second sign was the sound of 1,000 small things striking the ice in rhythm. Not swords, not feet, fingers. Then the third sign was that the men who had been left as watchers at Eastwatch did not answer, and the watcher sent to ask why did not either. Jon moved. He did not speak louder than he had to, because men hear better when you spare them shouting. He moved them as he had rehearsed on days when the sun had been a rumor you told boys to make them laugh. The barrels went to places marked in chalk and memory. The spears went into hands that had shaped other tools and would shape this one if they lived. The doors were barred and then unbarred and then barred again, as if the act itself kept fear in and let courage out. When the dead came up out of the storm, Jon was on the wall walk. He had put himself there not because he loved it, he despised it, but because it was where men could see him, and that made them either brave or steadier, and both were good. He did not hold Longclaw in the air like a banner. He held it low like a farmer holds a hoe. The dead met the fire where it remained and went through it, because wanting is stronger than pain when the thing that wants is no longer in pain. The pale captains came behind not to lead but to choose, to put their hands on the places that would hurt most. Jon watched them picking and tried to pick back with less grace and equal force. Bran stood below with his hand on the old heart tree and his face a mask of ice. He spoke not to men but to roots, and it was a strange comfort to hear his flat voice telling them what the trees remembered. Sansa moved where men thought she could not, flinging sacks of sand where wind blew flame too fast so that it hugged and did not run, lifting a boy to his feet and pushing him back into his place so hard it set him properly. Davos swore in a whisper like a litany. It kept count of their arrows until the counting failed, then kept count of men instead. Tormund met a pale captain on a landing narrower than his shoulders and hewed it to pale splinters while laughing like a man at a feast who has just seen the girl he loves walk in. The wall held because they held it. It held because the old spells were not words in books. They were hands on ice and feet in snow and the labor of backs and the staves of men. The crack at the leaning tower widened and then, raggedly, stopped widening. The sea at Eastwatch skinned again and the dead ran across and the cliff there took them and then threw them away with fire. Men fell. So many men fell that counting them insulted the scale of it. Ed did it anyway because he believed in insult if it kept you honest. The dead fell more, but they rose where the fire did not reach and kept coming until the dawn thought about changing the color of the sky, and the pale captains looked up as if reprimanded by a master and then turned and drifted back into the blizzard that had birthed them. They did not cheer. They did not have breath or men or the taste of it. They stood leaning on spears and on one another and on the wall itself and made of themselves a barrier you could not walk through. Jon felt the ache in his bones like something that had been left in him when he was made. He found Sansa and she was still standing, hair rimed with frost and eyes bright and mouth stubborn, and it seemed to him that if the world were going to end it would have to ask her permission first. "You held," she said, as if he had been late to supper and finally turned up with a rabbit. "We held," he said. Ghost came then with blood on his muzzle and a gash over one eye and laid his head against Jon's thigh. Jon put his hand on the great skull and found the place between the ears he had always known. That night they burned their dead under a sky that crackled. The smell went with the smoke where it goes. They said the names. There were too many names. They said them anyway because names are part of spells and you keep spells strong by using them. At the end, Bran said one in a voice so soft only Jon heard it over the crackle and hiss and the low, unmusical song of men too tired to sing. "Rickon." "I know," Jon said. Bran turned his head toward him like a hinge. "You kept the wall. He cannot break what men mean." "Not yet," Jon said plain. "Not yet," Bran agreed, as if satisfied with a bargain still being struck. Sansa stood a little apart and watched the black sails of smoke. When Jon went to her, she did not look at him, only leaned her shoulder to his for a moment the way a woman leans to a post when she is done and will not fall. "You could still come south," she said after a while, "because we go back to our arguments the way we go back to the fire for warmth." "I am south of where I should be," he said, which even made her smile. He added, "Because some truths can be spoken and some must be kept until they are so obvious they no longer need saying. If you call, we will open the gate." She breathed out and the breath was visible and turned to nothing. "Then I will only call when I must." They went on. They did the terrible small work that keeps a great thing from failing. They calibrated oil and measured oats. They sent boys to sleep because they would be better men for it later. They wrote to Manderley for more salt. They sent Davos to the rills for pigs and to the mountain clans for men who laughed at cold as a friend. They listened to Bran when his voice went distant and he said, "He moves," and they set their watches according to the pace of another will. They waited for a dragon that did not come because in this telling it had not been found. They made do with what the earth broke loose from itself at their demand. Winter lengthened into the kind of story old men tell to hold children in place and keep them from going out into the snow too far. The stars hid their eyes for long stretches and then looked down, affronted, and then hid again. The North learned to send what it had not because it was generous, but because when the wall holds, Winterfell sleeps. And when Winterfell sleeps, fishermen's hands keep working in water that steals fingers if you're foolish. The South forgot them because the South is always forgetting what does not throw a feast. The Night's Watch became a rumor again in a different way and did not mind it because they had work. Jon did not become anything else. He rose when he must and slept when he could and put his hand to the ice and felt it steady under him because he was steady on it. He read Sansa's letters and folded them carefully and put them where touch made memory. He listened to Ghost's growl change in pitch when the wind changed. He stood with Bran when Bran's eyes went the color of a sky that has lost its day and counted breaths until they came back. On a morning when the frost on the black fur of Ghost's back made him look like a thing carved, Jon went up to the top of the wall at dawn. He went alone because sometimes you must be with the thing you've chosen without a witness. He put his palm to the old ice, and under it he felt a thrum like the heartbeat of slow gods. He saw a long white line running to the sea and a little black town stuck at its foot like a burr. He saw where the crack had been and where it had been mended with old wood and newer blood and the weight of men. He felt nothing that felt like triumph. He felt something that felt like truth and its cost. Ghost came and leaned into him with the casual weight of trust. Jon set his hand on the wolf's neck and watched the horizon until the light there gave up trying for color and became only light. He could have been many things. He could have been a lord with rooms of his own and a name that was not only the price of other people's honor. He could have been a king if crowns were things men put on people who did not want them. Instead, he was this, a man at a wall. It was not nothing. It was not everything. It was what he had chosen and kept choosing. Below him, the yard woke as men wake in winter. Slowly, grudging, practical. Ed's voice rose in complaint that was half prayer. The smith cursed love at his anvil. A boy laughed because he had kept his fingers through a night and could hold a spoon. Somewhere Sansa was instructing someone to mend something and to do it now. Somewhere Davos was making a list and crossing a thing off it and finding an addition in the space between. Jon straightened and took his hand off the ice. He flexed it to warm feeling back into the skin and descended the steps with his breath before him like a small white banner. His watch had not ended. That was not the grief it once would have been. It was the ground under his feet. He put his boots on it and walked. He walked through the waking clamor with a sense of the day coalescing around him like hoar on a railing. Frost squeaked underfoot. Out by the kettles, the old midwife from the gift was already shouting at lads to stop breathing the steam as if it were soup. They laughed and did it anyway, and she cuffed one lightly and fed him first. Ed had found a rake from somewhere and used it to pull snow from the roof where it had drifted into treacherous cornices, muttering about men who died for heroics and men who died because roofs were bastards. Davos stood with a slate and a stub of charcoal and 2 fingers licking the charcoal now and again like a cat tasting something bitter, his eyes flicking up as he tallied the day's tasks. Shadow Tower sent 20 sacks and a man who can set broken bones without setting a man screaming, Davos said when Jon reached him. The sacks are oats, the man is sour. We'll manage both. And the men from Deepwood? Jon asked. In the yard, learning that spears bite better than they look, Davos said. Lady Glover sent a woman with them who outshoots all of them. Says her name is Asha to anyone who thinks to ask. Says it cold enough they don't ask twice. Asha? Jon repeated, the name stirring an old seaborn rumor in him and settling again. If she shoots well, I care as much for her words as for her name. He turned. Ed. Ed leaned over the rake handle and wore the look of a man resigned to having his name taken in vain before breakfast. What disaster now? The Night Fort, Jon said. We've left the Black Gate too long with only ghosts for company. I want men there who know their own feet and won't mistake a story for a solution. Take 30. Boards, oil, tar, chain, torches. No fires in the vaults unless you wish to boil us all in our skin. Put eyes on the well. Post 3 men at it and forbid them jokes. Jokes? Ed said, deadpan. At the Night Fort, you will be cutting off a man's very breath. Cut it off, Jon said, and keep a runner between us and you at all hours. If anything speaks, you ignore it. If anything sings, you run. Preferably away, Ed said. All right then. I've always fancied living below ground in a place that eats men. If I don't come back, I'll blame the soup. You'll come back, Jon said and clapped his shoulder. Tormund sauntered up while Ed was gathering a squad and scowling them into competence. His beard glittered with frost as if someone had dipped him in sugar. What's this of holes in the world? Old holes, Jon said. We'll plug them with men. Men is scarce good fodder, Tormund said cheerfully. But we've used worse. I'll go sniff. If I smell old gods, I'll spit and call it even. You'll go to Eastwatch and sniff the sea, Jon said. It froze once and carried them like a road. I don't want to be surprised by roads. He looked past Tormund's shoulder. Sansa had come to the yard, a fur thrown over her shoulders and her hair plaited simply for the cold. She moved with intent, the purposeful lope of a woman who had thought ahead. Brienne shadowed her with that knack of being present without crowding, Pod beside her, taller again and starting to look like his limbs belonged to him. Lady Sansa, Jon said as she reached them. Lord Commander, she said, with the smallest flicker of her mouth to show she'd said it to tease him. The Manderley wagons are a day out with salted pork and onions if the roads hold. I've sent riders to mark the worst drifts. I need men at the way stations. Not many, 2 at each hearth to keep fires banked. Men who won't drink the oil and swear it was ale. Davos, Jon said. I'll find us our 2 at each, Davos said. We'll send boys half-grown and old men who think themselves useless. Make them keep the kettles singing, and you'll have saved more lives than a hero and his sword. They'll need a name, Sansa said. Something that feels like belonging. If I call them kettlemen, they'll sulk. If I call them hearth wardens, they'll preen. Call them keepers, Davos suggested. Men like being told to keep. Keepers, Sansa repeated, tasting the shape of it. Good. She turned her head slightly, listening toward the western wall where a horn was being tested for cracks. She had learned to listen like that, past the loudest noise to the thing under it. Is there word from Sam? Not yet, Jon said. He promised it would be soon if it could be. He always promises that, Sansa said, not unkindly. He will arrive when it suits a library to let him go. He smiled. Something like that. She studied him for a beat that felt like a held breath. You look thin, she said, and he laughed, because it was the simplest truth and the easiest to answer. I'm thinner when you're not here to scold me, he said. I am leaving at noon, she said. I have to keep the North in mind, or it will forget itself. He nodded once, the acceptance in him practiced and true. Send me word of everything, especially of nothing. When nothing happens, men slacken. She put her hand on his wrist. Through glove and wool he felt the pressure anyway. I will. Her gaze slid past him and hardened. Lord Baelish, she said flatly. Littlefinger came into the yard with a smile that had edges. He had always looked as if he were on his way somewhere else, but here at the wall he had to accept being stuck with the rest of them. He disposed his body as far from the wind as possible and made the cold seem like a choice he'd declined. My lady, he said, bowing just enough. Lord Commander, Tormund Giantsbane, unless I misrecall you. I confess, I prefer giants when they are used to grind flour. Your flour would taste of piss, Tormund said without heat. Not the worst flavor found at court, Littlefinger murmured. His eyes flicked to the wall and back. I bring word from the Lords Declarant of the Vale. They wish to know when the Knights of the Vale might be permitted to return to their own wives, who will forget them if they stay here too long. When the dead forget us, Sansa said, you may tell them that from me. No, write it, so they remember the tone. He had the grace not to smirk. And if the dead never forget, then their wives will learn to live without knights or husbands, Sansa said. It has been done. Littlefinger's gaze brushed Jon and slid off as if oil had been poured over stone. There are safer walls to stand behind, my lady. There is coin still. Corn to be bought in the south and brought north by men who like the taste of coin and think themselves braver than winter. Buy it, Sansa said. Buy it and send it here. If you bring me a bill padded too nicely, I will send you into the yard with a spear and ask you to show me your courage. He put a hand to his heart and bowed as if she had made him a promise instead of a threat. My lady, you slay me. Not yet, she said. He drifted away like smoke. Sansa watched him go with a look even the wind could not enter. He thinks the wall is a tale to frighten children into their beds, she said low. He thinks the wall is a thing to lean on while he counts his next 10 steps. I do not know how to make him understand. You already did, Jon said. You put him where the wind can talk to him. He glanced toward the stables. I'll see you to the gate. They rode out at noon when the light had given up on being gold and settled for being a more honest white. The keepers had already begun to occupy the wayhouses. Sansa rode the line of them, counting, checking, promising. Brienne rode with her, her cloak a pale blur in the drift. Jon watched from the gate until they vanished into the same whiteness that everything vanished into. He stood after the last speck went and stood a little longer, so that if anyone watched him they would see not longing but diligence. Then he turned and went below to the armory to look at the newest ugly spears and tell the smith he was clever and mean it. By evening the first of Ed's runners came pounding in, face red, fingers stiff with cold. "Sire, my lord," he gasped. "There's a face in the stone at the night fort, in the well. We covered it. It sang when we covered it. Then it stopped. Ed says the well is thirsty." "Thirsty for what?" Davos muttered, not to be answered. Jon took the runner to the fire, warmed his hands, heard everything he knew how to ask and some he did not. He wrote, "Hold and feel nothing and want nothing," and sent the boy back with the words and a pouch of salt. "Scatter it," he had written. "You will feel foolish. Feel foolish." Sam came on a day that should have been no day at all for traveling. The wind had dropped. Not a mercy, but a trick. The snow fell straight down like sifted flour and made the world a place of soft lines you could lose yourself in. A horn blew once on the outer gate. One long call, living men, and they led the mule cart through with the blanket tied over the beast's eyes so it would not balk at the smell. Gilly sat piled in furs with the babe she would always call Sam and did not put him down, even when the mule kicked and the cart lurched. The man leading the mule had not shaved properly for months and had ink on 3 fingers and a bruise like a shadow under his eye from lack of sleep. He stopped inside the yard and looked up at the wall and grinned like a boy. "You took your time," Jon said, and Sam laughed, breathless. "They wanted me to stay," Sam said. "They always want that. I told them you needed me and they smiled the way men do when you say something that makes you look like a fool. But I've brought you what makes fools less foolish. Books and other things." "Books?" Ed said bleakly, appearing from somewhere like a complaint in human shape. "We shall hurl them from the wall and brain dead men with knowledge." Sam blinked at him, then smiled wider. "If you bind them, Dolorous Ed, they make good shields." "Finally," Ed said, "something good comes of letters." They made a place for Gilly near the kitchen and a place for Sam near the fire, and Sam unpacked like a man producing rabbits from a hat where no one expected rabbits to live. He had maps in tubes and parchments wrapped in oilskin and a sheaf of pages sewn together crudely with twine. "I copied this myself," he said, proud, tapping the sewn thing. From a book the Archmaester thought was worth a laugh. The oldest texts are the ones you have to squint at and pretend you don't see the holes in, but they carry sounds in them that newer ones don't. This one speaks of binding spells. Davos sucked his teeth. "Spells? Words that mean," Sam said, serious. "Everything that holds was made to hold with words as well as with hands. The wall's old part is ice and stone. The most important part is vows. There are passwords that were used when the spells were set down. Not words to break them, words to mend them when they cracked with seasons. You can't make men believe with sounds, but you can teach the sounds to the ice again." Jon took the sewn pages in hand, their edges rough against his fingers. "Can you read it all?" "Some," Sam said. "More with Bran's help. He knows the shapes of sounds no one remembers knowing. And I asked permission to bring a maester." A man had followed behind him, unnoticed in the fuss of greeting, gray-haired and trim and wearing a chain that seemed too light for the cold. He had the pinched look of a man who had always been a little too tidy for the world. He bowed to Jon as if to a steward at court, a courtesy that was not contempt. "Maester Harmune," he said, "formerly of Raventree Hall. The Citadel and I are on poor terms, which suits me. I've been sent to observe and advise and write down what will be a lie in 100 years if I write it too well." "Do not write it too well," Jon said. "I will write it so poorly no lord will read me," Harmune said, and smiled with narrow delight. It may save lives one day. Sam's eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely from the cold. There's more, he said, a little wildly, as if the more might explode if not set out at once. The horn. John looked at him and then at Bran, who had been sitting by the brazier teasing heat out of cold stones with his hands. Bran's eyes had widened as if to meet the words halfway. I cannot find the horn of Joramun, Sam admitted, almost shamefaced, as if he had lost a borrowed spoon. Not the object, but the more I read, the more I think the horn is not a horn only. It is a pact. His fingers plucked at his belt, then stilled. There were kings beyond the wall who bargained with the first men in winters past. The children watched. The words were put down in a way men could blow, so that the agreements would be heard. Blow the horn. The rivers wake and shake the ice. The great cold wants to move and cannot. Blow the horn. The walls the children made stir and remember. Blow the horn. Men who swore freed the giant in the hills to come smash the wall. But those are songs. The pact beneath is in binding words that say, when men hold, the wall holds. When men forsake, the wall forgets. And the others? Davos said. They need not the horn we need, Sam said. They need the unbinding. They need a break in the vow. Not one man, as many as will make the meaning weaker. They may blow a horn to frighten us, but the thing that hurts is when we mean less. John thought of the mutiny and the weight of knives. He thought of his own death lying on a table that should have served bread and served him to it. He thought of the way his hands had shaken over ink until he set them in snow and let the cold straighten them. Then we will mean more, he said simply. Harmun's lips pressed together in a twist that might have been approval. Masters of words, are you? Good. You'll need to be. Teach the words to carpenters. Teach them to keepers. Teach them to boys who think words are what women do in kitchens. Sam tugged at the twine again, eager. There is a ritual, no blood, he added hastily, seeing Davos's eye narrow. No blood, bread, iron, fire, water, the four things that remember men best. If a sworn brother speaks the old words as he sets each of those in the places the wall is thinnest, the wall hears him, takes the sound into itself like breath. But it will not answer one man as the spells were bound in a chorus. A chorus, John repeated. How many voices? As many as we can teach, Sam said. Hundreds, thousands if we can. Not only black cloaks, says, men of the realms of men. If the words were meant broadly, let us give them what they were meant for. He looked at Sansa's empty chair as if she were seated there. John felt the same tug, the way a living thing pulls toward its twin. We'll send the words south, John said. We'll write them simply and right. Sansa can call them in the hall, and the clans can speak them in caves and in the Dreadfort cellars and on White Harbor's quay. We'll teach them to mountain men and millers and boys who cannot grow beards. If the old spells listen, let them hear us all. Good, said Bran, the syllable flat and huge, as if someone else had spoken through him. They began at once, because beginnings are best when you haven't time to admire them. Sam and Harmun wrote the chant out in plain script, and Sansa copied it in a neat hand so clean a child could follow it with a finger. Runners went south with copies in oilskin, tasked to find a voice at every hearth. The keepers were taught first. Here is fire, speak. Here is bread, speak. Here is iron driven into ice where it will bite and hold, speak. Here is water poured where the ice will take it, speak. Ed said the words like a man sentencing soup to the pot and made them stick in 30 men who would not have remembered a song for silver. They tacked paper to posts and doors. Do not sing to the wall without knowing the words. The words were short enough to live in the mouth, old enough to sit in the bones. The night fort breathed. Ed's messages were clean and spare, face still silent. Well, no longer singing. Rats bold. Men bored, which is when they become stupid. Keeping them busy. He added a line that read like a joke and wasn't. The Black Gate says nothing if you do not introduce yourself politely. The Black Gate? John asked when the runner had gone. Sam, Ed had scrawled further down. the letter stiffer where the charcoal had run thin. Brought a notion and a pair of mad eyes. Made us stand in the vault and say the words. The stone-dead weirwood in the wall looks like a face if you had imagination when you were a child and then lost it. His mouth opened. Not wide. Wide enough for the smell of leaf to come. It closed when we stopped saying the words. I recommend against using it as a door, but I like it better for moving than for being a mouth. Sam flushed when John put the letter in his hand. I thought perhaps, if the gate speaks, the wall still listens there. I thought we might, if we must, move a small group. Not if, John said. Only if. And we post men on the stairs, and we forbid any man alone. He touched the parchment. Ed is right. No more. Not there. No humor at Eastwatch either, though Tormund insisted on making his men laugh because laughter put iron under Fear's feet where it skidded. The sea had grown restless again, ice forming and breaking in rafts. White bears howled from the floes and battered themselves to pulp against the cliffs and rose again and battered again. They lit them with pitch and listened to the fat crackle. The cliff face had iron spikes now hammered in where men could lash ladders, and the ladders were dragged up behind them each time until the lads could do it half asleep. Men slept with spears. They burned what washed in that had no breath. They burned what washed in that had too much. The second time the horn blew from the north, it sounded wrong to the ear. Deep and layered, like river ice shifting and groaning and a long bone being bored through. Men went still with a predator's stillness. Sam lifted his head so fast he swayed from it. Bran's face went blank for a heartbeat, the eyes sliding toward a place John could not see. They blew something, Bran said. Not the horn that belongs to this wall. Another one from farther and old, and it made a sound like a lie that's close enough to taste like truth. Do lies help? Davos asked. They gather the ones who want to believe, Bran said. They make a noise in the world the same shape as their want. The crack at the leaning tower twitched. You would have missed it if you had been looking anywhere else. John had been looking nowhere else for hours. Get the men, he said softly. They moved as they had trained to move. Keepers came with their baskets. Bread wrapped in cloth to keep it from freezing the instant it touched the air. Small hearth irons hammered into blunt squares. Skins of water. A jar with a coal cradled in ash so the fire would not die before they reached each place. Brothers came with the black spears and the oil and the old songs with the new words stitched in. They divided, a team to each of the wall's thin places. Sam and Harmune to the leaning tower with Bran and Jon, because if the oldest spells needed the strongest hands, this was where to be. They climbed to a platform where the wind punched cheeks. The ice there had been scored by centuries of boots and by the uneven kiss of winter sun. You could feel the weight of the sea far away pressing up to meet the weight of the sky, and between them men with foolish hot blood and breath that steamed and made banners of itself. Jon set the little square of iron against the ice with hands gone clumsy in their gloves. He had learned this too. How to do work a child could do, and make it into a commandment by doing it when others were afraid. Sam's voice took the chant first, low and steady. The words were not beautiful. They did not need to be. They needed to be right. He said them like counting. Harmune said them as if reading a line in a recipe he suspected would fail and wanted it to succeed anyway. Bran said them in an old rhythm Jon had never heard, and his skin prickled when he did. Jon added his voice not because it was strong but because it was one more. Ed's men said them from the top of the well at the night fort, and the sound came up the stone throat alike to smoke. Keepers said them at fires by the way stations. In Winterfell's great hall, with the snow creeping under the door like a dog that wanted warmth, Sansa stood before a rough altar built of bread and iron and a basin of water and a brazier and said them to men who listened as if she were the old Nan they had missed without knowing it. They spoke the words and set bread on the ice, and the bread steamed. They spoke the words and drove the iron home, and the iron clanged not hollow but as if it had struck something living and made it answer in its own tongue. They poured water and it hissed and took. They opened the coal jar and the ember woke and kissed the cold and drew back and kissed again and held. The crack at the tower's foot closed by the width of 2 fingers and then stopped, stubborn as an old man on a bench. It heard, Sam whispered, breathless. It heard. Once is for showing, Harmyon said. 1,000 times is for making. They did it again. For 7 days men walked the wall in pairs and fours, keepers plodding between, boys with lips cracked from saying the words too much and not enough. They fixed what could be fixed. They learned where the hearers were. They learned where no hearing remained at all and marked those places in red paint so vivid it made men start when they passed even in the dark. The third time the deep horn sounded, men laughed out loud because their mouths had learned not to be cowed by it. The wall held because they told it to, and the telling was labor. They labored. They bled over rope burns and split knuckles and newly sharp iron edges. At night, when the cold crawled excessively under clothes, they dreamed the chant and woke with their mouths moving. Sansa returned with a caravan that looked like the back of winter itself. Oxen with frost on their eyelashes and wheels that had to be beaten with hammers to turn. She had a line in her cheek Jon had not seen before, and Littlefinger did not ride in her shadow. When Jon asked, she said, "He went south, or he vanished. I do not mourn." She did not elaborate and he did not press. Men are owed their secrets when they do not break your walls. Arya came with her, quiet as a shadow and only a shadow until she chose to be seen. She walked into the yard and 2 dogs who had never taken a liking to anyone but each other went belly up at the smell of her, as if deciding at once she was theirs. She was thinner than Sansa and carried herself with a different kind of ease, looser and more ready to break into something that was not dance. She kissed Jon once, hard, grinning, eyes flicking over his scars to count them without pity. "Look at you," she said.
Aprupe cum mande.
Hair all grown out to hide the sulk. "Look at you," he said. "Alive. You keep doing that." "I do," she said. She tilted her head at the wall. "I came back to see the thing you wouldn't leave. It's ugly," she added, cheerfully honest, and he laughed. "She's found work," Sansa said later when they had bread between them and a heat that pretended to be generous. "Work that suits her. She left Winterfell because the hall was too crowded with men who like to be seen. She likes not being seen." "You'll stay?" Jon asked Arya. It was not an order. He knew better than to lay commands on the wind. "Not for long," she said. "You have 1,000 men who can swing a spear. I go places spears don't fit. But I'll prick any finger that tries to lift the latch on your old gate." That night a boy from White Harbor went missing. He had been on the wall walk with a partner, and the partner came down and could not say if the boy had stepped backward or forward or if a voice had said his name. Jon went up himself with Arya for company, her boots silent on the ladder rungs in a way that would have been poetry in a softer world. The wind clawed, but the air was clear. The wall walk was a white stripe laid out as if by hand to mark the boundary of survival. "Here," Arya said after a time, kneeling. She touched a scuff with 2 fingers, gentle, then put those fingers to her tongue like tasting flour. He turned. A step. He put his weight on the wrong edge. She looked up at Jon. "You can teach lads not to hear ghosts. You have to hammer it into their heads. When a voice says their name at night, they will answer to a brother, not to air." "We'll drill it," Jon said. "I will break a man's nose for answering shadows." "I'll break his ear," Arya said. "Better." They did drill it. Ed took to the exercise with vicious joy. "Name the name you most want to hear." He barked at boys who blushed or swallowed or stared mulishly ahead. "Now ignore it. More ignoring. Like you ignore me at dinner." Exactly so. Bran's dreams were a battlefield no one could join. He sat under the godswood and stared at a place in air that hurt to look at. "He is curious," Bran said, when Jon asked what the other did when the horn was not sounding. "He walks along the wall and puts his hand where the spells are thin and lays his cheek where men mean less and tastes. He has not forgotten. He is not new." "Then we won't be new either," Jon said. "We'll be stubborn." The others came when the moon shaved itself to a sliver thin as a second thought. They had tired of tasting and wanted meat. They came in 3 prongs, like a fork you didn't see until it pricked you. Down the frozen streambeds north of the Shadow Tower, across ice that had set glass hard in the bay at Eastwatch, and through the trees west of the Night Fort where the air seemed to hold its breath in a tight fist. They did not roar. They did not drum. They came like a decision. At the Shadow Tower, men had met them before on narrow ground and learned the only answer to the patient dead: make the ground narrower still. They had felled trees across the streambed, sharpened their branches, coated them in tar that had been heated and flung by ladles on poles until the points were glistening black and wicked. Whites care nothing for pain, but they do care for their legs if you cut them off. The front ranks impaled themselves, and the ranks behind trampled them into a ladder for the rest, and the men atop the bank rained oil and bolts until the night stank like a tanner's yard. It was work men could do. They did it until their arms said no more and were taught to say yes with curses. The pale captains watched and learned. One by one, slow as spite, they stepped back. At Eastwatch, the sea had a mind to be stone again. It did not love being stone. It creaked about it. White bears swam to the ice and hauled themselves up and lumbered silently toward the cliff, figures out of a child's worst notion of a story. Men meeting them remembered other bears that had bled. These did not bleed. They baked the ice into glass with poured oil and smashed it. They drove hooks into the cliff and hauled men down on ropes to set flares on crude platforms and tossed them up again before the dead could grab their boots. Tormund took a bear through the eye on the third throw and bellowed with delight as if he had made a good jest. His second threw wide, and a bear swiped a man's leg off below the knee as idly as a man swats a fly. They heaved the man up anyway, yelling like sailors, and the man lived to swear more carefully. At the night fort, the well breathed out a smell like rot covered in flowers. Ed's torches guttered and flared and did not go out. "Name the sender," Ed said loudly into the dark. "Name the mother. Name the kettle you stole and the dog that bit you when you were 5. Do not answer the well." The men answered Ed instead with filthy truths, and the well sulked. Somewhere underneath, something knocked once, hollow as a drum half full of water. In Castle Black, Jon put men where the wall thinned and felt the thrum under his hand that meant the old work was still working. He had the chant in his mouth and did not even know he was saying it until Bran touched his wrist and Jon clamped his teeth on it and saved the last of his voice for orders. Sansa moved the keepers like pieces on a game board with none of the game's nonsense. She sent bread where men were shaking too much to hold bowls. She sent coals where the fire lagged. She sent iron to drive where the cold had made the old bars brittle. Davos counted and then began again because counting calmed men. Sam told boys who wanted to run that they could run from fear to duty and look like they were running toward something, which is a better way to run. Arya found 3 men who had wandered from their posts and made them sorry without shame. Toward midnight, there was a different sound. Not the horn, not the scrape of dead things. A low rumble, steady, with a note in it that made the hair on Jon's arms lift. At the leaning tower, the crack trembled and inches of ice flaked from it, powdering the air. The rumble grew. You could feel it in bones. "What is that?" Davos said blankly, and Bran turned his head and said, "Giants." They came like moving hills, the ones dead long enough to be stiff but not long enough to forget the shape of walking. Fur hung in strips. One approached the wall where it was thinnest and laid his huge dead hands against the ice, and the wall responded the way a man responds when another man leans too hard on him. Gave an inch that felt like much more. A second giant paced along the base like a prisoner measuring his cell. The third lifted its head and looked with casual, cold interest at the men above. "Dragonglass," Jon said. "Fetch the long ones." They had made them as a joke almost, Tormund demanding a spear worthy of being named a spear and not a pin. The smith had given in to the boast and forged shafts as long as pikes with iron sleeves to seat the black heads. They were heavy, unwieldy, silly. Jon took one, his hands settling where the wrapping told them to, his breath quick and controlled. He gave it to the man whose stance pleased him and took another for himself. "Aim for the belly," he said. "Make a hole big enough it can crawl through to die." They threw with all their arms had. The first spear took the closest giant under the ribs and sank a hand's length and no more. The giant looked down at the little tooth with something that was not surprise. The second spear missed entirely and clanged off ice with a child's shame. The third, thrown by a boy who had always been poor at the haft and good at tossing stones farther than his brothers, went straight between 2 great ribs and lodged deep. Smoke curled where it bit. The giant turned his head to see what had bitten him, in the slow, disbelieving way of a thing that does not understand pain anymore, and then he sat down as if tired. The weight of him made the wall shudder. He slid to one side and lay with his huge dead face to the ice and did not rise. The other two backed away, slow as if shadowed by thought. The thought not theirs. Behind them, pale captains stood on drifts and watched with the insolent patience of winter. John took a breath. It went in thin. "How many giants do they have?" Davos asked. "Enough to count," John said. "Not enough to stop. Keep throwing." They threw until their shoulders felt like hot knives in cold sheaths. They killed another, and the last one went back in the storm and was lost in it. The rumble eased. The horns did not sound again that night. The dead came on and were pushed off and came on and were burned. The night grew old and decided not to die. Men clung to the wall and to one another because that is what men do in winter when winter is thinking about eating them. When dawn uncurled itself from the horizon, it had a sickle's thinness. Men blinked at it like new things. The dead stepped back not because they were tired, but because the thing in them that understood the shape of day told them they were not wanted. They went like fog undone by the sun. What they left behind froze where it lay, half-crusted with light. They did not cheer. They looked at each other to see if they still had faces they knew. Ed coughed and made a face as if he had tasted something worse than lamp oil. "I hate mornings," he said. "They keep coming." "Count," John said, and Ed counted. They lost 34 across the night, including the man whose leg the bear had taken, who went out of the world with his hands clenched and his eyes open and asking. They lost 3 at the night fort to a fall that should not have happened and did, because it does. They lost 1 at Eastwatch to cold that had been granted an extra bite. They lost 2 boys who could not stand the sound of their names whispered on the wind and ran to answer and were caught by Ghost in the snow and brought back kicking and bit John when he held them, and were forgiven that minute. They lost sleep. They lost fear's sharpness and got a duller, more useful kind. Sansa sent the chant farther. They set a brazier on Winterfell steps and gathered folk. Old Nan had gone long ago. Women took her place and spoke the words. The Manderleys said them in a quarter voice on White Harbor's quay where the sea choked on slush and the gulls looked offended by it all. The mountain clans made jokes of them, then made them theirs and stopped joking. Children intoned them at play, not understanding what they meant and learning anyway. The wall shivered less for a dozen nights. Littlefinger returned in a letter with neat handwriting. He wrote about grain and coins and ships and the sweet white wine of the arbor with the same tone you used to describe skinning a rabbit. He wrote, "Do not make enemies you didn't need to make. If you will lose, lose quietly." Sansa read it by the fire and fed it to the flame, one line at a time, and told no one the words. Arya went on ranging with small numbers, earning a way of moving across the yard that made men step aside without knowing they had. She took 3 men at night into the trees north of the night fort and cut the throats of whites that hung easy in branches like dolls, and came back with a new scar on her arm and eyes that didn't brag. John asked her what she had learned, and she said, "Don't get clever, do what works." And he wrote the words and hung them in the armory where boys would see them when they fumbled their laces. Sam and Harmune gathered old iron from the armory and hammered it into plates that could be belted to chests by men whose bellies had failed them for fat or empty for lack of food. They lined mittens with felt and learned to rub oil into leather to keep it from cracking so fast you could hear time on it. Sam wrote until his fingers cramped and then wrote with his other hand, sending copies of the chant by the bundle, so that when one fell in a drift and became a slab of ice you could still find a dry one inside and read. Harmune pestled soot and blood and ash and spit and made an ink that would stick to ice long enough to be read while you shouted at a boy to read aloud. Bran went away sometimes even when he sat among them. Once he came back with tears frozen on his face and could not say at first why, and then he said, in a voice that broke and then did not, "Hotter," and John did not know the story and did not ask. He put his hand on Bran's back and left it there until his fingers went numb and kept it there anyway because some things you do become better by being done too long. When the worst of the cold lifted a hair, Sansa went south again. So did the Vale Knights, some of them, and the men from Deepwood, because the north was not only the wall and needed guards on roads where bandits with empty bellies thought themselves wolves. Davos went with them, because there were lords who preferred to have numbers read to them by a man with scars and manners than by a woman whose voice reminded them their wives might be smarter than they were. He returned as the river began to think it might one day be water again and said, "Lord Manderley has salted fish that bite like iron. He'll send them. He wants to be praised." "Praise him," Jon said. "Name the fish after him. Call them Wyman's mistress if he wants." "He wants a song," Davos said, grimacing. "Ed," Jon said, "compose something with rhymes for Greece and beneath my knees and bastard's ease." "Make him sorry," he asked. "I have been sorry since I was weaned," Ed said. "One more sorrow will sit easy." Summer refused to come. Spring stretched thin as a skin on milk and quivered and did not break. Men learned to say, "When the sun comes back," as a joke that worked more like prayer. The others came less often and more cleverly. They watched the keepers with blank curiosity. Once, a pale captain walked bold as brass to within a stone's throw of the gate and stood and then turned without hurry and went away. And the men who had watched him did not think some of their thinking came back to them until days later. From the south a packet. A thin hand and neat script. Sansa wrote, "Cersei Lannister has burned the city's faith and sits upon a chair of knives calling herself queen." Another packet. "The Dragon Queen has crossed and sacked a fleet and burned a line of wagons and broken a Lannister army like a loaf of day-old bread." Another packet. "The Dragon Queen looks north and the wind pushes her back." Each was written as if the names were weather and she was telling him how to dress for it. Each ended with bread and salt and a number of bushels and the names of the keepers who had died and the names of those who had had babe sons and babe daughters and the ticking on, remarkable for being ordinary, of a world that refused to stop. "We could ask the Dragon Queen to send fire," Harmune said once, dry. "We could ask the Lannister Queen to send ships. We could set our table with threats and beggars and hope both come to topple it." Jon shook his head. "If fire comes, we'll use it. If it does not, we will use iron. We won't waste breath on queens." Sam peered at him. "If she sent a letter asking you to bend the knee, I would tell her what I tell the wind," Jon said. "When it blows the wrong way, I lower my head and I keep my feet. I don't ask it for a crown." Word spread of what they had done on the wall with bread and iron and old words. Peasants in the far north of the Gift, 2 old men and a girl with bad teeth, held their own wall of piled stones when a band of whites found their field at dusk. They stuck bread to the stones with grease and hammered rusty nails in with a shoe and poured water and spoke the words haltingly. The whites slowed there, confused as if someone had moved a familiar path a foot to the left. The men fell on them with axes and the girl with a frying pan. One of the men died leaning against his own stones with his mouth open, surprised to find himself done. Jon read the report and sat with it in his lap and a stunned, tired wonder in him. "That's it," he said, to no one and everyone. "That's what we are. Not kings. Men who tell other men that the work works. Men and women." Sansa's next letter corrected mildly, as if she had overheard. "Do not forget us or I will send Brienne to hit you with a loaf of bread." He smiled at the fire and took the words to the deck where men would walk over them and know they were true. One night in high winter, when the moon rode huge and empty as a skull, the horn sounded again. This time it was not the bluffing horn, nor the low tremor of giant feet. This time it was 3 short blasts from the top of the east tower. Rangers, then again. 3. Men scrambled. Jon was already moving, Longclaw in hand, his breath a violent cloud, bones agreeing with the cold in the old way that says, "I know you, you know me." At the tower's top the watchman was white around the eyes. He pointed with the certainty of terror. They came out of the trees, not in a line or a rush but in a column that cut a neat hole in the night. At their head walked a figure taller than most, draped in rime as if in silk, carrying a long spear of ice that did not melt in breath. He paused, and every dead thing behind him paused, and he lifted a hand in a gesture that read like greeting if you wanted it to. The wall did not like him. Jon could feel it in the grind of ice underfoot, the subtle squeal you only hear when the whole of a thing says no. Bran climbed the last rungs so calmly Jon wanted to shake him. He went to the crenel and looked with eyes that had looked at other centuries. "He is old," Bran said. And not the oldest. He is not the first. He is repeating a thing he thinks he remembers without knowing why. What does he want? Davos said, which is always the only question. He wants a gate, Bran said. He wants us to open. Then he can want, Jon said. He can make wanting, Bran said. He can take a man who wants to go to his wife and make that one a shovel to dig with. Jon drew breath. Ed. Ed was there, sour and reliable. Yes, I will stay a bachelor. Wake the men, Jon said. Pairs, triples, hands on shoulders. No one stands alone. Tie them if they lie. If anyone laughs at you, make them laugh with a mouth missing a tooth. Ed said, without humor. The tall one waited. The wall ticked. The chant rose at the thin places without orders now. Keepers making a work song of it. One line, and again. The figure tilted his head slightly, listening without ears. His ice spear's tip lowering until it pointed straight at Jon. Me? Jon said softly. You'll be disappointed. He was not disappointed. He stepped forward and drove the spear of cold forward the length of his arm, and the air between man and wall frost-flowered like glass. Jon did not think. He did the thing his arm knew. He brought Longclaw up not to meet the spear. Iron on ice would be folly, but to strike the air itself where the cold had made a path. Valyrian steel met a thing that was not there, and sparks that were not sparks flew, pale and brief. The spear shuddered. The ice along its length cracked with a sound like thin glass set on a hot stone. The tall one drew it back with a jerk that looked almost human. He stepped back. He looked left and right as if assessing flanks only he could see. He lifted the spear, turned, and the column of dead moved with him in a neat, pivoting block. They vanished into the trees without hurry, the way a thought vanishes when it finds no purchase in a skull. Did we just send him away? Davos said, incredulous. We disappointed him, Jon said, his breath gusting. He felt the return of feeling in his fingers as a pain and welcomed it. We'll disappoint him again. Ed leaned on the Merlin. You know, I never thought I'd be the man men looked at when they needed hope. You're not, Arya said from behind him, and he jumped. She grinned. We looked at your nose. It points home. He snorted and blinked smoke from his eyes. Point me at the kettles. I'll point men at bowls. Time became something they wore. It chafed and warmed and carried them. The world did not end. It amended itself. The dead came and were thrown back. The ice cracked and was mended over and over. The chant went on until it went down into men's bones, and they did not have to think to find it. The wall had more voices in it than it had had in 1,000 years. The North sent more grain than it could spare and did without, and was proud of itself in ways that would become a song later, and later some maester would sniff and say the song was exaggerated, and Harmune would write under his breath, exaggerate more. Men are lazy without heroes. In the thaw that was not a thaw, Sansa brought children to the wall. Not to the top. No one with sense did that as parade, but to the yard where they could see the shadow of it and learn not to be cowed by its size. She set them to washing the bowls women washed and teaching them the chant with bread in their hands. She stood between two of the midwives and laughed with them about nothing and everything, and one of the Knights of the Vale watched her and looked away when she turned, ashamed of how he had looked. Brienne watched him look and did not have to say a word. Why bring them? Jon asked later, when they had heat enough between them to speak quietly. Because the living must touch the thing they're saving or they'll forget why, Sansa said. Because I want boys who'll grow into men of the Watch to have a memory before the oath. Because I want girls who'll never wear black to know what the words mean when they say them to their sons. Because I am not our father, but I try to keep his house as he did, and he would have done this. Jon nodded. He thought of Ned Stark standing under the weirwood with the light on his face and the shape of honor not as a song but as a habit. He would have done this. The night fort did not sleep. Once, Ed sent back a message that made Jon tilt his head like a dog at a new whistle. The face spoke, said my name. It said, Keeper. It said, hold fast. I told it I am trying. It did not laugh. I like it better than most men. Old magics wake like old women, Sam said, pleased. They are cross and they ask you to fetch things and they tell you you're doing it wrong and then they pat your cheek and murmur that you've done as well as could be expected. Hells, Ed said when told. If I wanted patting, I'd find a granny. He did, sometimes without admitting it. When the queen with the dragons finally sent a man, he was thin and wore the look of a man who has learned to be polite because his life depends on it more than his pride. He brought a folded cloth that stank faintly of smoke and a letter with a flourished hand. The letter spoke of alliance and common cause, and the letter spoke of bending the knee in a circled way that did not demand and did not forget. The cloth unrolled to show the scale of a dragon burned at the edges, matte black in places and iridescent where heat had not crazed it. The man said there was a mountain of dragon glass on Dragonstone his queen would give gladly and ships that would bear it. He looked at the wall and swallowed. We have obsidian nearer, John said. We have iron enough to marry it. We have men enough to wield it. Tell your queen the wall is not waiting. Tell her the wall is working. Will you bend? The messenger started. The word a stone he had been told to carry and to hide, and he could not carry it any farther. I will not, John said gently. Not because she is not a queen, because I have bent the knee to an older thing, and if I put another knee to the ground, I'll split myself. The man nodded, relieved beyond politics. I'll tell her, he said. She will not like it. She may like the world keeping, Davos said mildly. She may like that more. When the man left, Sansa watched him go with a considering look. If she had come herself, she murmured, not to Jon, not to anyone. I would have told her to bring a cloak. She wears fire, Arya said. Fire goes out, Sansa said. Arya smiled. Not if you keep it. The year turned not by the sun but by men's hands. They learned to mark time by the measures that mattered. The depth of the fat on the pork, the thickness of a mit, the weight of ice, the silence between horns. They counted losses in ropes and in names. Sansa sent out a call for women who knew how to mend properly, and she set them teaching men with thread and made the worst of the lads too proud to learn where their sashes wrong until they asked kindly for help. It called them ducks and made duck noises until they agreed to be human again. Davos built a ledger tall enough to climb and kept climbing. Bran sat under the godswood and stopped a story once and stood, trembling, and said. He turned aside, and no one had to ask who. In a thaw where snow in the yard looked like soft bread torn to pieces, a weirwood sapling sprouted from a crack in the old wall by the armory where none had grown in living memory. Its bark was pink. Its leaves were red as if the tree had bled gently for itself. Harmune marked the day quietly and did not write a poem. Sam touched a leaf and cried with surprise, and the leaf did not wither. Bran smiled as if someone had whispered a joke only he had the ear for. Men mean it, he said. The trees here. Jon stood with his hand on the old ice and felt the tremor of it as a kind of rough joy. He did not let himself step away from the work just because something had answered. He did not lift his face to the sky as if expecting blessing. He went to the yard where a boy had split an arrow shaft with another arrow and fetched the first arrow out and gave it back and said, Again. On a late afternoon when the light had a bruised look, Sansa came to him with a letter. She did not speak at once. He looked up into her face and saw what the letter had already done to it. A smoothing, a balancing that looked like gentleness if you didn't know her. Read it, she said, and he read. And it said, Mother is dead, scrawled clumsy by a man who had never learned to write when he should have and had learned now to spite the world. It was not their mother. It was Gilly's. The letter had taken a year to crawl through hands and snow. Gilly took it with quiet hands and sat and did not speak and put her cheek to her babe's skull the way a woman leans into the only present thing. Sam held her and then went and found Jon because you go to the man who has made himself a place that takes grief like a cup takes water. Say something, Sam said helplessly. I will go sit with her, Jon said and did. He did not offer words because his own had worn thin and nothing would carry. He sat the way he had sat with men the night before they went up the ladder and the night after they came down without a piece of themselves. He learned again how presence fills the spaces words cannot. Gilly wept and then did not weep and then fed the babe and then slept sitting. John stayed until dawn nosed at the door and left without waking her. He went to the wall and put his hand to it and felt it listening. In the last great push before the year bent toward half and showed no hope of release, the others came once more in a wide arc. They had learned the places where the wall bit hardest, and they avoided them with a cat's disdain. They threw themselves where the men were thin. They came in storm and went in storm. Teeth chattered like dice in a cup. Blood froze. Oil turned sluggish. The chant frayed and was caught and knotted and thrown on. They came and they were thrown, and they came and men fell and were picked up and set back in place by hands that had been made stubborn by stubborn hands. At the height of it, when the sound of it had become noise and that noise had become the only world, John looked left and saw Ed standing with his back to a parapet, blood on his mouth and his eyes very bright. He looked right and saw Sansa with an axe in both hands, not swinging it like a fighter but bringing it down like a housewife chopping bone for a stew. He saw Arya vanish and then appear with a smear of something on her cheek that had been a man and now was only a stain. He saw Sam holding a boy's head to his chest and breathing into him as if breath were a thing you could share like bread. He saw Bran with his hands on the ice and the shape of a crow's shadow over his head where no crow flew. He saw himself reflected in the ice very briefly, a black figure with a sword he had not earned and a scar he had. And he did not look away. He put himself into the work. When the dead withdrew at last, it was not because they had been crushed. They cannot be crushed. It was because they had found the measure of what stood against them and had learned that for now that measure was enough. They went in a line like a line of geese in winter, and the cold they left behind was an emptiness that men rushed to fill with heat and names. Ed slid down a parapet and laughed once, a shocked explosion. Sansa leaned on her axe and closed her eyes and opened them. Arya disappeared. When she returned, she had 3 rings and a disgusted look and washed her hands longer than necessary. They counted again. They always counted. They burned. They spoke the words. They made inventory of oil and breath. They set names in the ledger and underlined them because names deserve lines. Jon dreamed that night that he stood under the weirwood and it was summer and the leaves were full and blood-bright. Ned Stark stood across from him with a look that had made him straighten his back as a boy because it had said without words, "Be a man of your word." Jon said to him purely without anger, "I refuse to leave," and Ned's face changed in the particular way it had when he was proud and didn't want to embarrass a child. "I know," the dream Ned said. "I know, my son. And if it was only a dream, it was the kind that takes the place of a missing piece and sits there not ashamed to be poorer than truth and worth as much to the hands that touch it. Spring did not come in a day. Came as a rumor. It came as a day when the oil did not thicken like honey in bowls. It came as boys shirking their scarves for 10 minutes and not losing their ears. It came as a star that had been shy showing itself a little longer. The dead remained beyond, present when called, patient. But they came less, and when they came their captain studied and decided and stepped back. They had met a wall that did not end, because it was not only ice. They had held. The line of the world did not move. It bent here and there. It flexed, creaked. It did not break. Sansa read the last of the ledgers for the season by the light of a candle that sputtered, and put it down, and went to the yard where Davos was arguing with a teamster about wheels and their proper greasing. She waited for him to finish and then took his hand and said, "Ser Davos, you did not sleep this year." "I promised myself I would," Davos said. "I am a man known for keeping my promises." He smiled with weary amusement. "Perhaps next winter." She laughed, surprised by it. "Perhaps next winter there will be no next winter," she said. "If the gods are bored with us and want new players," Davos said. "If not, well, we know how to do it now." Jon stood with Bran on the wall walk in a soft wind. The ice hummed a low, old chord under them. Ghost leaned into Jon's knee and looked out, his ears pricked, his breath steady. "He is not gone," Bran said. "I know," Jon said. "He waited longer once," Bran said, his voice like a page of an old book being turned. "He will wait shorter now. We mean it more," Jon said. "He can wait. So can we." Bran's mouth twitched. "You always think waiting and meaning are the same." They are, John said. When you've chosen. He did not go south. He did not take a crown. He took each day and set it into the next like stones in a wall. It was not glory. It was not a song. It was the thing that had saved the world once and might save it again if men remembered. He made them remember. He made himself be the one who remembered if they did not. He walked the wall walk and put his hand to the ice and said the words with a voice that never forgot itself. At last, in the slow kindness only the North believes in, the snow retreated a hand's breadth from the stones in the yard. You could smell water without tasting iron in it. A raven arrived with the first mud on his feet anyone had seen in months. He cocked his head and peered as if to say, "Are you done yet?" They were not. The work does not end. But they could breathe without watching their breath like a man counts coins. Men laughed and did not flinch at their own laughter. John went to the top of the wall at dawn again. He put his hand to the ice and closed his eyes. He felt what he had felt before. He felt a steadiness that owed him nothing and owed him everything. He said, not because anyone needed to hear it, but because he did, "I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls." He said the rest. He said, "This night and all the nights to come." Ghost's tail thumped the ice once, twice. The sound was small and deep. John smiled into the cold. Below, the yard woke. It grumbled. Sam coughed ink out of his neck. Sansa argued with a cooper about hoops that should be tighter. Arya laughed at something no one else had seen and vanished around a corner. Bran sat with his eyes open and far away and came back with a shiver. John turned and went down the steps, each one a piece of work that had to be done and was worth doing. His watch had not ended. He did not want it to. He was what he had sworn. And the wall, old, stubborn, truer than men deserve, was what men had made it and still made it, every day. He took his place in it. He held. He would hold. He went on.